there's nobody who commands the universal acknowledgement and the universal, I think, respect that the Dalai Lama does.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
To the Middle East now, and more than 50,000 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began. That's according to the territory's Hamas-run health ministry.
I'm Roland and this is Battlelines. It's Monday, the 7th of July, 2025. This week, peace may finally be coming to the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu is headed to Washington to talk to Donald Trump about a final ceasefire in Gaza. Meanwhile, David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary, has headed to Syria to meet the new president there. Could there be a new golden era emerging as the dust from nearly 2 years of war begins to settle? I'll be talking to Adrian Blomfield, the Telegraph's senior foreign correspondent, about that. But first, this past weekend, the Dalai Lama celebrated his 90th birthday. To mark the occasion, the leader of the world's Tibetan Buddhists outlined his plans for succession, or reincarnation in his case. The announcement drew immediate condemnation from Beijing. To help us understand how the politics of reincarnation works and the link between Tibetan spirituality and geopolitics, I turn to the Telegraph's Mick Brown, who has met the Dalai Lama and literally written a book on this subject. Mick, welcome to Battle Lines.
Thank you.
Just give us a rundown of the news of the week. The Dalai Lama is turning 90. What has he said and why has it caused such a stir? This
is an announcement which he talked about coming at the time of his 90th birthday. What he said is that in accordance with the wishes of the Tibetan people, he says that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue. And he's also said that that he intends to reincarnate in the form of the Dalai Lama, and that will happen at some obviously unspecified time shortly after his death. And that no other nation or country or body has the right to recognize that reincarnation apart from people appointed by him, basically the Central Tibetan Authority, which is the government in exile in Dharamsala. So this is a deliberate attempt to sort of see off the Chinese, as it were. There's a rather complicated story behind this, but for the Chinese, the Dalai Lama has long been a thorn in their side. And they would seek to take the opportunity of the Dalai Lama's death to appoint their own Dalai Lama. And the consequences of that would, as you say, be geopolitical, basically, because it would be the Dalai Lama. Not only is he a very important figure to the Tibetan people, but his role as the foremost spiritual leader of the Buddhist world obviously has ramifications in other Buddhist nations in Asia. And for the Chinese to have their own Dalai Lama, so to speak, is a way for them to sort of exert leverage over those other nations around them.
I feel like at this point we need to get into the context because I've been looking at a lot of the reporting and around this, and it's kind of being discussed as if everybody knows who the Dalai Lama is and what's going on and so on. And there was a time, I think I can remember, when I was younger, Free Tibet, the Dalai Lama was one of these massive public causes that was everywhere, that seems to have fallen off the radar. Could you explain to us just the basics, please? Who is a Dalai Lama? Where's he come from? What's his job? And what are the origins of the issue with Tibet? And maybe if you could lay that out first, and then I want to get to why it's somehow fallen off the radar.
I mean, the Dalai Lama is the shorthand would be that he is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism. In 1950, China invaded Tibet and consolidated that invasion in 1959. There was a popular uprising against the Chinese occupation within Tibet. And at that point, the Dalai Lama fled into India. Now, he's primarily a spiritual teacher, a religious leader, but at the same time, he then became the voice for a free Tibet. And I suppose that's what most people would perhaps know him as. And in 1989, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And as I say, he's been a constant thorn in the Chinese side, not simply as a spiritual leader, although I can talk about how that is fundamentally important, but also because of his constant talk about the conditions inside Tibet and the need for, not for Tibetan independence. What he's always advocated is what he calls the middle way. And I think this is a pragmatic realization of the fact that Tibet is part of China in terms of sovereignty. But the middle way approach that the Dalai Lama has long advocated is that there should be some degree of Tibetan autonomy in terms of preserving the language, the culture, the religion, so that Tibet as it was should be preserved. And the Chinese over the years have done their best to extirpate that. I mean, there's been terrible brutality against the Tibetan people. There's been terrible assaults on Tibetan Buddhism, which is the very heartbeat of Tibet, and has long, for centuries and centuries, have been the very heartbeat of Tibet. And so him saying now, I will reincarnate, the Chinese basically have no authority. This is what he's basically saying. The Chinese have no authority to appoint their own Dalai Lama. And so you will have this standoff where, in the fullness of time, a Dalai Lama will be recognized by Tibetan exiles, and the Chinese will have their own person who they say is the Dalai Lama. So that will be the scenario at some unforeseeable future. But you're quite right to say that in a way, Tibet as a cause fell off the radar. And I think that's largely because of pragmatism has triumphed over principle. And there was a time when the Dalai Lama would be welcomed at Downing Street, for example. The last British Prime Minister to greet the Dalai Lama in Downing Street was Tony Blair. The last American president to meet the Dalai Lama was Barack Obama. And with the rising economic power of China, so nations have subtly and not so subtly sidelined the Dalai Lama, while still professing their support for him as a spiritual figure and recognizing his moral authority, but at the same time fearful of offending the Chinese. And the Chinese, they've been very vocal. If ever the Dalai Lama does meet a political leader, they're very vocal in their disapproval and almost with their veiled threats when that happens.
Because it was a time when he was kind of spoken of in the same breath as Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the two of them around the same time were held up and widely, universally recognized, if you like, as exemplars of moral integrity. In the Dalai Lama's case, of a great kind of spiritual quality, which, having met the Dalai Lama, I can say, he honestly has. He's an extraordinary person, and that is palpable when you meet him. So I think there was an enormous widespread support for the Tibetan cause. Free Tibet flags, benefit concerts, Hollywood stars. Richard Gere, of course, is well known as a long-term follower of the Dalai Lama. But as I say, I think pragmatism took the place of principle, very sadly.
I want to get into the deep history here, just because it's such a kind of mix of. We were talking yesterday before we started this, and I think you framed it as a kind of a mixture of politics and magic in a way. I mean, to talk about, we're used to talking about elections or coups, or when kings die, there's a succession, but reincarnation is not something we really talk about. So to really go back to the basics, what is a lama and what's a Dalai Lama?
A lama basically means teacher, a religious teacher. The office or position, if you like, of the Dalai Lama goes back to the time when high lamas were spiritual teachers to successively the Mongols and then to the Qing emperors. And the first Dalai Lama was, actually I should say it's the third Dalai Lama, but I'll explain that. The third Dalai Lama was the spiritual teacher to a Mongol emperor.
So what kind of century are we talking about?
We're talking here about the 15th century.
Okay.
He was given the title Dalai Lama, Dalai meaning ocean, but sort of understood to mean ocean of wisdom. And the relationship of
Is that a Tibetan word? Or
it's a Mongol.
It's a Mongol word. So that's fascinating. So it's actually even a Mongol word. It's not Tibetan.
Yeah.
Okay.
And at that time, the relationship between the lamas and the emperors, is probably best defined in the expression that in public the lama would bow to the emperor. In private, the emperor would bow to the lama. So this is how fundamentally important spiritual teachers, Tibetan Buddhist teachers, were to emperors, particularly within Tibet itself. And I think this is something that really needs to be understood. The Chinese have ruled Tibet for the last 75 years. What they have failed to do is they have failed to capture the very heart and soul of Tibet, which is religious belief. And that's one of the reasons why, famously, when the Dalai Lama was 19 in 1954, he went to see Mao Zedong. And Mao poured blandishments on him. But then the final words that Mao said struck fear into the Dalai Lama's heart, which is, religion is poison. But when the Dalai Lama fled from Tibet in 1959 and went into sanctuary in China, Mao is supposed to have said, we've lost. And the reason he said that is because he knew that the one thing he couldn't control was the Tibetan belief in Buddhism. And that the person who exemplified that, who embodied that, was the Dalai Lama himself. But over the successive years, that is the one thing that the Chinese have tried and basically failed to control. The name of the Dalai Lama, you can't read his books in Tibet, you can't mention his name, you can't have photographs. It's not a law, but it's understood what the consequences would be of that. But the sentiment of the Tibetan people and their respect and veneration for the Dalai Lama cannot be eradicated.
Okay, so he's one of these special people who
he is at the summit of this idea of identifiable reincarnation.
Right.
Yes.
And so he's been reincarnating since the 13th century, you said.
Since the 13th century.
Right. How does one reincarnate? I mean, how does one know that a child, after a Dalai Lama dies, how does one know that a child who's been born somewhere is the next Dalai Lama reincarnated?
Well, this is where we enter the realm of the magic as opposed to the politics. And there's a long tradition of how these recognitions take place. In the case of the present Dalai Lama, who is the 14th, shortly after the 13th Dalai Lama's death, the story is said that the 13th was sitting in state and his head turned to the northwest. And this was said to be the first indication of where they should begin the search for the next Dalai Lama. There is a sacred oracular lake in Tibet called Lake Lamo Latso. And after this indication from the 13th Dalai Lama, high lamas went to the lake, and looking into the lake were given various signs and divinations about where they should begin looking for the next incarnation. And among these signs and divinations was the vision of a monastery in the northwest, following the direction that the 13th had indicated. So a search party set out, and in the fullness of time was guided to a particular house where a particular 2-year-old boy was to be found. Carrying with them, they would have various possessions that had belonged to the 13th. And these included a bowl, prayer beads, and other things. And the boy was then given a test. Mixed in with these objects that had belonged to the 13th were other objects, similar objects. and he was given a test, which ones are yours? And again, according to the story, the boy said, this one is mine, this one is mine, and this one is mine. So he was 2 years old. He was taken away from his parents. This may sound like child abduction.
I was going to say, what do the parents feel about that?
This would have been the highest imaginable honor. Taken away from his parents, taken to the Potala Palace in Lhasa, where he was brought up from a very, very early age, educated in theology, philosophy, all of the rituals and philosophy of Tibetan Buddhism. What he's always said of himself is that he is a simple monk. And as fanciful as that may sound, that is essentially what he is. He is a monk. But by virtue of the fact of being the Dalai Lama, he then, in the fullness of time, became the temporal head of Tibet as well. For want of a better word, the sovereign of Tibet, although that's not entirely accurate. But so Tibet was a theocracy, at which the Dalai Lama was at the pinnacle. But Tibet at that time, it's been described as a factory for saints. Huge numbers of young men and boys would go into monasteries, and as I said, Tibetan Buddhism and the power, if you like, of the monasteries was the preeminent force within Tibet.
Right. So this is kind of mid 20th century. He was born in 1935.
Exactly.
Which is, and it's been described at the time as almost a medieval society. I mean, quite backward in some ways.
Yes, I mean, a feudal society. I think it's the 14th Dalai Lama. There's a man named Heinrich Harrer, who was a German who'd been taken prisoner of war during the Second World War, and he came out of India and went into Tibet. The contact between the West, as we know it, and Tibet would have been very sporadic. Because Tibet, of course, is encircled by high mountains. Actually, a British expeditionary force had gone into Lhasa in 1904 under Young Husband. So there was some contact. And Tibet at that point became a sort of pawn in the great game between Britain and Russia about who is going to sort of have governance over this area. But in terms of its political system, it was a theocracy, and so this has long been used as the sort of explanation or the justification, if you like, for one of the reasons why China invaded Tibet, and of all the benefits that have supposedly accrued from this. And it must be said that Tibet now is in a very modernized society and very, very different from what it was in the Dalai Lama's time. But that has been at a tremendous cost to the people and to their beliefs.
You described it was a theocracy. This is the guy who was at the top of the theocracy. Therefore, he is someone with temporal political authority. That gives us something. That gives us an idea of why the Chinese are so concerned.
Yes.
Tell us about that. There is a dispute about how the succession should be managed. So he said his successor has to be found in the traditional way, rather like he was found. The Chinese have a different plan.
The Chinese do have a different plan. And if you didn't think it was complicated enough already, this is where it does get complicated. Historically, a key figure in recognizing the Dalai Lama would be somebody called the Panchen Lama. And as I said, the Dalai Lama escaped into India in 1959. The Panchen Lama, 10th Panchen Lama at that time, remained in Tibet. And he then died. And because he's a very significant figure in recognizing whom the next Dalai Lama will be, or in rubber stamping, for want of a better word, the recognition of the Dalai Lama, this then presents a very interesting opportunity for the Chinese, because they have the potential to bring forward their own Panchen Lama. What the Dalai Lama did in 1995 was that he, in order to sort of subvert that process, he recognized a boy who had been born in Tibet as the Panchen Lama. And this followed the traditional procedure that I'd outlined earlier, the visions in Lake Lama Latso, the divinations, all of those things. So he recognized a boy. And the moment that he recognized that boy, the Chinese immediately arrested that boy, 6-year-old boy. And he and his family have not been seen since. And he's been described as the world's youngest political prisoner.
So he's still alive?
He's still alive. He's believed to be living in mainland China, for want of a word, in Beijing, having arrested and disappeared the Dalai Lama's appointee. 4 years later, the Chinese then brought forward their own boy using a method called the golden urn.
Another Panchen Lama?
Yeah, another
right.
boy.
Okay.
Yeah, another boy. And this is a method that had been employed back in the 18th century, again when the Chinese had some sort of, or the King Emperor had some sort of authority over it. Let me just
summarize. So Dalai Lama has to be recognized by a Panchen Lama.
It doesn't have to be, but it's tradition and custom.
Okay. Traditional custom says you need a Panchen Lama to recognize a Dalai Lama. So the Dalai Lama nominates a Panchen Lama. The Chinese abduct that Panchen Lama, disappear him, and then they produce their own Panchen Lama.
That's right.
Okay. And in order to make this Panchen Lama legitimate, they've used a method called the golden urn.
That's right.
Right. I hope you're keeping up with this. Tell us
about
the golden urn.
I know it's complicated.
And the golden urn, if I'm right, this goes back, I think, to the 18th century.
That's right. The Chinese used the golden urn to bring forward a boy who they now say is the Panchen Lama. And he is sort of paraded around China. He's taken to monasteries. He's met the Chinese premier. Just met him a few weeks ago, where he vowed loyalty to China and gave approval to the Chinese practices in terms of religious practice in Tibet. So we have this boy whom the Chinese have said is the Panchen Lama in Tibet, and we also have the boy who the Dalai Lama says is the Panchen Lama. He too is in Beijing. So this does present a sort of a question mark, at least, about when the Dalai Lama dies, there will not be a Panchen Lama in the free world who could recognize the next incarnation of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has been quite specific in his address earlier this week that he will reincarnate in the free world.
Outside China.
Outside China.
Okay.
Outside China. So it remains to be seen quite what sort of process will take part in that. And of course, a lot of the practices and rituals and sacred places that have traditionally been involved in this recognition, Lake Lama Latso in Tibet, it will not be possible for somebody to go to Lake Lama Latso, which is now actually closed off by the Chinese. But I think that the Dalai Lama himself has been, certainly in Tibetan terms, a great modernizer, and not somebody who's hidebound by ritual and custom. And I have no doubt that they will find some way of following traditional practices within the constraints of being in India, not in Tibet. But it has to be understood that among the vast majority of people within Tibet, whatever the Chinese do has no moral or religious authority. I mean, the present Panchen Lama, the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama, as I say, he goes to monasteries, he goes to public events and so forth. It's said that the government actually have to pay people to come onto the streets and sort of cheer for him and wave katars and flags and so forth. So the one thing the Chinese have never, for all of their efforts, for all that they've done, they've never been able to undermine the spiritual authority of the Dalai Lama, nor have they been able to completely extirpate the belief in Tibetan Buddhism, which is the very heartbeat of Tibet.
The Dalai Lama, he's turning 90. I think we believe he's still in fairly good health. We don't think this announcement came about because he thinks he's going to die soon. But listen, when he does die, does the Tibetan cause kind of die with him? Because he's been such a, as we said, a kind of almost a Nelson Mandela figure at certain times. Can anyone keep that cause alive after him?
One of the problems with the whole system, difficulties with the whole system, is the interregnum period between a Dalai Lama dying and his next incarnation, as it were, coming of age in order to assume that position. So you can assume a sort of 20-year interregnum. I mean, there are other very prominent Tibetan lamas, the most prominent of whom is somebody called the 17th Karmapa, who is widely revered in Tibet and among Buddhists throughout the world. But certainly there's nobody who commands the universal acknowledgement and the universal, I think, respect that the Dalai Lama does. So I think it will be a very precipitous time for Tibet and for Tibetan Buddhism at that time.
Mick Brown, thank you very much for joining us on Battle Lines.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Coming up, as the dust settles from nearly 2 years of war in the Middle East, might a ceasefire in Gaza finally emerge this week? And could it trigger a new golden age for the region? Welcome back. Things are changing quickly in the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu is meeting with Donald Trump to hammer out the details of a potential ceasefire with Hamas. The war in Gaza could be ended as soon as next weekend. Meanwhile, David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, has headed to Syria to meet that country's interim president for the first time. After nearly 2 years of war, is the dust finally settling across the region? And what kind of a Middle East will emerge? I spoke to the Telegraph's Adrian Blomfield, who has spent the past few weeks travelling the region and speaking to Israeli and Arab leaders. Adrian, what's your sense of the landscape of the Middle East as a region as it emerges from this period of nearly 2 years of war, really?
Yes, I think there is a lot of talk because obviously people realize that these are potentially decisive moments. What it all means, no one quite knows. But I've been speaking to a lot of Israelis in the last week, particularly generals who are no longer in active service, to talk about what they think. I've been recently in the UAE. I've spoken to officials from 3 different Gulf countries. And I think there's consensus about the fact that there is a possible new era in the Middle East. But much depends primarily on one man, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu. As you say, Mr. Netanyahu is in the White House today. He'll be meeting Donald Trump, and there will be a feel of a sort of Roman triumph sort of atmosphere there, because, as far as both men are concerned, when it comes to Iran, they have been vindicated over the wishy-washiness, as they see it, of their critics. So for Donald Trump, who likes to broker peace deals, he will be pushing for that ceasefire in Gaza. Netanyahu, that remains to be seen. But for Netanyahu, there is this belief that Israel could be standing on the brink of some kind of golden era, because there is now no more dominant force militarily than Israel in the region, because Iran has been humbled. And certainly to supporters of Netanyahu that I've spoken to, they believe that Arab states are now queuing up to join the Abraham Accords. Those are the deals first brokered in Donald Trump's first term, at the end of his first term back in 2020, something he believes he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize for, that saw a normalization of relations between Israel and 4 Sunni Arab states. That's the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, and Sudan, which didn't actually ratify it in the end. They believe that there are a lot of countries that want to now follow suit, including possibly Lebanon and Syria. And if that is the case, if that were to happen, we would see, for the first time, Israel living at peace with its neighbors. But there is a great deal of skepticism around, and certainly not everybody sees that. And there are very mixed feelings from Gulf Arab leaders that I've spoken to.
That's an extraordinary thought. I mean, a normalization of relations between Israel and just thinking about Lebanon or Syria, there's the whole question of the Golan Heights that, when was the last time anyone was able to make that very, very short drive between Beirut and Jerusalem, which, you used to be able to do it on a train, I believe, many, many, many years ago. Flesh out a little bit for us. When they say golden era, what exactly does that mean? What is this vision of an Israeli golden era?
So, I mean, for decades, Israel has been in this state. I mean, it's interesting. Someone pointed out to me that actually Israel hasn't fought a direct war. So the war with Iran, the 12-day war, as Mr. Trump calls it, the 12-day war was actually the first direct war with a foreign state that Israel has waged since 1973. That's the Yom Kippur war. But obviously, in those decades, Israel has hardly lived at peace with the vast majority of the Middle East. There were the Camp David Accords that normalized relations with Egypt and Jordan. But the rest of the region, for most of that time, has been hostile towards Israel. Now, obviously, things have changed, particularly in the Gulf over the last decade or so, as Iran became the biggest threat, particularly the prospect of a nuclear Iran. And so that drew countries in the Gulf towards Israel, seeing Israel as potentially offering a security umbrella over the region. Iran has certainly been weakened. And of course, that's not just over the 12 days of war last month. That dates back to, well, obviously Hamas, one of the limbs of the Iranian Hydra, is no longer properly functioning. It's unable to threaten Israel itself. It can't fire rockets. It's heavily degraded after obviously a very, very controversial operation in Gaza. Hezbollah, similarly, extremely weakened. Over those 12 days of war, the organization, Hezbollah, was founded by Iran in the 1980s and became Iran's main insurance policy. It was set up for this very reason, that if Israel attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, then Hezbollah would rain hell down on Israel's cities. And yet over those 12 days, Hezbollah has not fired a single shot. And indeed, so deterred is Hezbollah that in the months since the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah was signed in late November, Israel has killed more than 300 Hezbollah operatives, and Hezbollah has done nothing in retaliation. So it's very, very deterred. So all of these threats that have faced Israel have gone, and that now potentially opens up, as far as the Israelis are concerned, the normalization is that now people will queue up, and the hope very much is that Saudi Arabia will lead the way. So Saudi Arabia is the big prize when it comes to the Abraham Accords. That Saudi Arabia will now normalize relations, and Israel will live at peace with its neighbors. But I think that is potentially quite an optimistic scenario, and we can go into the reasons for why. But I don't, there'll be those who say just because Netanyahu wants that, that's not necessarily what is going to happen. And the big issue there is the Palestinian question. So Benjamin Netanyahu hopes he can park the Palestinian question, that he can either isolate or marginalize the Palestinians, and everyone will forget about the Palestinians and want to live in peace with Israel. And that's possible. That is possible. But, it's not certain.
You've been down in the Gulf relatively recently, speaking to officials in those countries on the kind of southern Western Arab side of it rather than in Iran. What are you getting from officials in those countries? How do they feel about this prospect of I don't know, what you seem to be described as a kind of an Israeli-led new Middle East?
So I think the Israeli-led bit is where we start to hit the first problems. And then I think we should turn to Lebanon and Syria, but particularly in the Gulf. So and the Gulf does not speak with one voice. So the Emiratis have always been a little bit more hawkish. the Saudis a little bit more cautious. And both sides, we'll need to remember, have decided to pursue the diplomacy track with Iran, because you may remember sort of a decade ago, until about 2019, 2020, these states were begging the US and privately begging, we think, Israel to hit Iran's nuclear facilities. And then things went wrong, because when there were attacks on oil facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia, 2018, 2019, and then various attacks on oil tankers and so on off the Emirati coast, Donald Trump didn't do anything. So they expected retaliation. That didn't happen. So these states then pursued, said, well, we don't feel that America is going to come to our rescue. We're the greatest at risk, because if there is going to be retaliation, the Iranians are quite possibly going to hit, yes, US facilities, US bases in the Middle East. And we saw that happening in a symbolic way with the Al Udeid base in Qatar, but also energy infrastructure across the region. And that's what they were most worried about. So they decided to pursue rapprochement with Iran. And that's why these states were, in public at least, very opposed to Israel taking action and the US taking action against Iran. But their worst fears did not come to pass. And so, as this conflict went on, and I was speaking to Emirati officials, they seemed to become more and more phlegmatic about it. And, one of them said, yes, despite what is being said in public, we have to be grateful that Israel is cleaning up the neighborhood, is the way one of them put it to me. But that doesn't mean that they're still happy. So they're grateful that the Iranian threat has been diminished, but they have two fears. One, that this isn't the end of the story, that Iran, a wounded beast, will reemerge and again threaten them. So, that threat hasn't been removed. And secondly, they're not sure about the idea of Israel being militarily dominant in the region. And, there's sort of this talk about, Israel as the new Sparta of the Middle East. And that leaves people feeling uncomfortable because, as a lot of people said, Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't seem to be a leader who can be controlled or restrained in any way. So what happens, say, if he decides to widen his war against Hamas by attacking sites in Qatar, where the Hamas political leadership has been based? What is off limits now? And so that is something that has potentially concerned people. And then, of course, there is the opinion of the Arab street. So, a lot of people in Saudi Arabia, or this is certainly what Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince MBS, is concerned about. He's tried to push forward these reforms while retaining an autocratic hold on government. He's concerned about growing discontent and growing anger about what has been happening in Gaza over the last 18 months. And so the Saudis have very specifically said, we will not join the Abraham Accords unless there is a clear demonstration by Israel that it is committed to pursuing a two-state solution. And that is going to be something that is very, very difficult. So these are the two things that have to be squared. Yes, on the one hand, the Israelis are right, those Israeli optimists around Benjamin Netanyahu are right, that there are countries who do want to pursue normalization with Israel. But, I think the thing that what they think that you can separate the Palestinian issue is not something that is guaranteed to work. And sorry to go on too long, but one final point that's worth bearing in mind is that for the Saudis, the key thing that is driving them at the moment, we talked just about MBS just now, is his pursuit of the Vision 2030 program. So Saudi Arabia needs to diversify its economy away from oil. It's pushing through these social reforms while turning its back on political reforms. And it wants to become this financial powerhouse. And it's taken a lot of the region with them. So they want this, the Middle East to be like Southeast Asia. And that means having to live at peace with Israel. So you've got that happening. But against that, you've got to square the sentiment on the street, and anti-Israeli sentiment has grown in many Arab countries.
Let's talk about those two countries to the north of Israel, to the north and the east, Lebanon and Syria, who, unlike the Gulf states, actually have borders with Israel and have been in active conflict with it for some time. You talked about potential normalization there. During the 12-day war, as it's being called, our senior foreign correspondent, Sophia Yan, joined us from Beirut, and she said that the conversations she'd been having with lots of ordinary Lebanese people was they were pretty positive about what Iran was doing to Israel, because they felt like it was Israel getting a taste of its own medicine, because they felt they'd been bombed an awful lot by Israeli jets in Beirut and elsewhere, which sounds like a bit of a hurdle to jump over if you're going to normalize ties there.
I think it's undoubtedly correct that this is a step further still. So if there are challenges to normalizing with Saudi Arabia, whose leader wants to normalize, is looking for opportunities to do so, but is constrained by public opinion, the UAE obviously has done. But this is going to be a step further still. But again, I think what we're seeing is a divide between the governments of Syria and Lebanon, obviously a new government in Syria, and the people. And we have to remember that Lebanon is a very, very divided society. I think I may have discussed this when I came on before during the war in Hezbollah, but with Hezbollah, Israel's operation last year. But when Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was killed, when the confirmation came through, the hotel that I was staying in, a small hotel in predominantly Christian East Beirut, on the floor I was staying on, it was full of Shia refugees. The Shias are the Muslim community that Hezbollah is drawn from. And all I could hear from the rooms around me was weeping and wailing for hours and hours. But downstairs in the restaurant below, there were people who had popped open champagne and were having a massive party to celebrate the demise of Hezbollah. So, and when you talk to people, say even Sunnis and Christians who are very anti-Hezbollah, were very angry with Israel because of the destruction that was being rained on their country. But we also have to remember that Hezbollah is very unpopular, and this is what I think Israelis are those optimistic Israelis are seizing on. And I don't think that they're making that connection from what Sophia was saying from people on the street. So Hezbollah is weak. It's unpopular. You know, Hezbollah perhaps made the mistake because when it was just an opposition movement, a guerrilla fighting force fighting against the Israelis, it was very popular. But then it entered government as a political party. And there have been all sorts of things that have gone wrong in Lebanon, from the port explosion, and people blamed Hezbollah for that, for reasons I won't go into now, the Lebanese economy, etc., etc. So there are other factions within the Lebanese system, supported by a lot of ordinary Lebanese outside the Shia community, but possibly even one or two within the Shia community, who would like to see and believe there is the opportunity to have Hezbollah defanged. And so there's talk of disarming Hezbollah, and the Americans are certainly pushing for that. And so you could remove this element that is very, very polarizing in Lebanese society. And so potentially, if you remove this big enemy of Israel, there is the opportunity for Lebanon to enter into a more normal relationship with Israel. And of course, there'll be elements within Lebanese politics who believe that Israel could even be an ally within this. But there are decades of history to unpackage in all of that, and there will be a lot of opposition. So yes, there's an opportunity there, but to actually get towards normalization is going to be very difficult. And so this is why I think, those who are being optimistic in Israel, I mean, I'm not sure that they're fully aware of all of the nuances within Lebanese society. And if we turn to Syria, I mean, it's the same thing. So, you've got David Lammy in Damascus, it's been an extraordinary few months since the toppling of Bashar al-Assad in December, and things have moved very quickly since Donald Trump's tour of the Middle East, where those Gulf Arab leaders persuaded him to lift sanctions on Syria, to expedite the normalization, which Syria desperately needs. I mean, it's got so much rebuilding to do. I was there in December. The scale of the damages is astonishing in large areas, particularly those areas which the Russians have bombed. And so Ahmed al-Shara, the new interim president, is desperate to burnish his credentials in the West, to welcome Western leaders. And he's sort of turned a blind eye to Israeli action in Syria, because, of course, the Israelis continue to occupy a buffer zone within undisputed Syrian territory, because obviously there's the Golan Heights, which Israel has annexed, but which Syria continues to claim. But despite all of that, there's a sort of an accommodation between President Shara and Israel, and so the Israelis think that they can build on that. But President Shara is also under enormous domestic pressure, and I think one of the things that worried me was a couple of weeks ago in late June, there was this horrendous suicide bombing in a Damascus church. Syria has a Christian minority, a Druze minority, but it's got a Sunni majority. And Shara leads a Sunni movement, HTS, Tahrir al-Sham. And we don't know this because the Syrian government has tried to blame Islamic State, ISIS, for the attack. ISIS did not make a claim of responsibility. And a lot of people think that this was an offshoot, a splinter group from HTS, showing their opposition to the steps that Shara has taken. And so, he's got to be very, very careful because, of course, he himself is a former jihadist with links to both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as are a lot of those people within that movement. So for him to move towards some kind of normalization with Israel, while it would bring in the kind of money and burnish his reputation that is needed to rebuild Syria, it's an enormous political risk for him to take. So, this is why I think both of those things, there are Israeli officials who think that can happen, but there are a lot of people who are very, very skeptical.
Adrian, thank you for all that. You said several times in this conversation that, the question that underlies all this and which has to be resolved is the question of the two-state solution of Palestine. We don't yet know at the time of recording whether a ceasefire is going to emerge or what it might look like. Benjamin Netanyahu is meant to meet with Donald Trump shortly. Probably by the time listeners hear this, they will have met. How has this nearly 2-year war in Gaza moved that question or changed it?
There's a lot to unpackage here. Of course, we have had, this is, I think, the third ceasefire that is being negotiated. So, a ceasefire doesn't spell the end of the war. It will be something that will dominate the news cycle for a bit. So I think what's perhaps of interest, as I said, I've spoken to 4 or 5 Israeli generals who are no longer in active service, but were at the top of various elements within the IDF in the last few days. And not a single one of them, I think 6 in total that I spoke to, not a single one of them said that they believed that there was any military purpose for the continuation of the war in Gaza, and that the war is therefore being fought primarily for political ends. And this is all to do with the complications of Mr. Netanyahu's right-wing coalition, and particularly the more radical elements within it. So from a military perspective, from an Israeli military perspective, it would make sense to have a ceasefire. And indeed, I think we've seen that because Netanyahu has shifted his prioritization now to saying we want to bring the, to end the hostage crisis. And he's emphasizing that now over the destruction of Hamas, which a lot of people, the generals I spoke to said is not going to be possible. But, that doesn't mean the end of it. So I was speaking to a guy called Eran Etzion, who was the former deputy head of Israel's National Security Council and ran planning at the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And he said basically Israel has now got three options to choose from. One is the live by the sword option, fighting a forever war, which goes even beyond sort of the Iron Wall Jabotinsky philosophy that was once advanced in Israel, and that means, you know, the maximalist position that's advocated by the Smotriches and Ben-Gvirs of the coalition. The second is conflict management, and that's what he believed Netanyahu wanted to do, which would be to continue fighting a low-intensity war with Hamas in Gaza. So, you know, kind of similar to what's happening with Hezbollah in Lebanon, an expansion of West Bank settlements, and as much as possible trying to remove as many Palestinians from Gaza, and trying to do that within a package that just is enough to bring in friendship with those Arab states, widen the Abraham Accords. And the third option is long-term peace building. And Mr. Etienne said that that's something that is not going to be under the table, on the table under the present government. And that is the rebirth of the two-state solution, trying to find a permanent deal and trying to find a way to bring some kind of normalization to Gaza. Because, you know, the question that still hasn't been answered, and we've not heard anything we've not heard anything convincing from the Israeli government, is what happens the day after. What is the long-term answer to Gaza? I mean, you know, we might see this sort of Riviera. There's certainly a lot of money, the Saudis and others, and including the Americans, to have this sort of Riviera idea. But, you know, I mean, how you get there, I don't know. I haven't seen anything convincing on that yet. So those are the three options. But, you know, there's nothing to suggest that there is anyone that Mr. Netanyahu would remotely countenance a two-state solution. He's always made that very, very clear. He was always opposed to it, even when Barack Obama was US president. He barely paid lip service to that. So, yeah, I mean, we may see a ceasefire, but I think the Gaza thing is going to be, you know, we saw a war finish in 12 days in Iran, in 8 weeks in Lebanon, but it's 18 months in Gaza. And, you know, that's just a sort of different operation. And we may see the end of the active phase, but the end of the Gaza crisis, I think, is a lot further down the road.
Thank you, Adrian. That's all for today. My colleague Venetia Rainey will be back on Friday with the latest updates. Until then, that was Battlelines. Goodbye. Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.